Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, are ordinary Russians getting all they bargained for as Vladimir Putin heads for re-election? Also this week, Saudi Aramco puts its IPO on ice and keeps the financial world guessing about the fate of the world's biggest stock market listing. Plus, open for business, the push to revive Zimbabwe's economy. Well, he is on track to become Russia's longest-serving leader since Joseph Stalin. As Vladimir Putin seeks re-election in the coming days, he might not be too worried about the state of the economy. There's been a rise in living standards over his 18 years in office, and despite Western sanctions and volatile oil prices, Russia's economy is still growing. On this week's show, we're looking at Putinomics and how ordinary Russians are likely to fare if Putin stays in power. Our Russia correspondent Rory Challens reports from the town of Uglitch.
Real Russia, as you're often told here, isn't found in the biggest cities. For that, you've got to turn up the car radio and hit the road. Leave Moscow and St. Petersburg for smaller places where Vladimir Putin's support runs higher. So we've chosen the town of Uglitch, 4 hours from the capital.
Здравствуйте.
It's where Lyudmila and Alexander live, a couple in their 80s, kind and hospitable, and both staunch Putin voters.
He is a very honest man. He would never say anything he didn't mean. And if a person is honest, speaks genuinely, and his deeds do good, you can say only positive things about such a man.
They see Putin as a strong leader and were particularly impressed by the recent State of the Nation speech where he pulled back the veil on secret weapons development.
We lived through a tough history with this country. We started our lives in a terrifying war. There was starvation and losses, and we understood this with our countries. The 90s undermined everything so much, uncontrollable times. But Putin slowly went in the right direction and brought us to the moment when we can see ourselves as a state able to take on immense tasks again.
After talking, an evening routine, watching the news. Unlike internet-savvy youngsters, older Russians still get much of their information from TV, most of it state-controlled.
There's a good reason why the support of people like Alexander and Lyudmila is so important for Vladimir Putin, and that's because when it comes to actually showing up on election day, pensioners are the most reliable voters in Russia.
Not everyone here is so enthusiastic, though. Out on the frozen River Volga, ice fishermen wait patiently for the bites. But when it comes to the elections, Nikolai isn't impressed with the quality of the catch.
Whom to vote for? There's no choice, no candidates. I think I'll vote for Putin. I'd like him to catch the thieves and mend our roads. He's reinforcing the army, at least that's something. But there's no one to choose. As soon as any candidate appears to slightly challenge him, he gets drowned immediately.
Such disenchantment backs up the view that Putin's support may be brittle, high only because of the lack of alternatives. And worryingly for the Kremlin, state pollster Vitsiom just noted a 12% drop in Putin's ratings in Russia's big cities. But Alexander and Lyudmila's allegiance is steadfast. In their long lifetime, Russia has marched to very different music. And they're happy with the man currently calling the tune.
Well, joining me now from London is Timothy Ash, a senior emerging market sovereign strategist with Bluebay Asset Management. Thanks very much for being with us. So is Russia under Putin's leadership equipped to deal with the current economic challenges?
Well, it's had a difficult few years. We had sanctions and lower oil prices from 2014 onwards. The Russian authorities kind of put the barricades up. We've had very tight fiscal and monetary policies since, and it's been about building barricades and defences. And that's worked in some respects. It's created financial stability, exchange rate's been pretty stable, inflation's dropped. The problem is they haven't had growth. Growth has been very weak and very disappointing. Arguably, fiscal and monetary policy has been too tight, too aggressive because of concerns about the geopolitical challenges facing Russia. And Putin's also held back from structural reforms. I mean, the Russian economy is in dire need of deep structural reforms, things like business environment, fighting corruption. There's lots of demographic problems in Russia, declining population. They really haven't been addressed. It's been a very cautious micro policy and actually a very cautious macro policy.
Well, the Russian government will point to their growth in the agriculture sector, saying that they're growing a lot more crops now domestically in response to the sanctions. How does that, for example, factor into the whole economy?
Well, it's useful, it's helpful. Obviously, agriculture is good for rural areas. But in the end, growth is less than 2%, and that's from a very low base. With oil prices recovering back to over $60 a barrel. So I think that's pretty disappointing. And we're very much back to the growth trend that was, before the problems that Russia had in Ukraine. And these deep-seated structural problems have really not been addressed. And I think after the elections, assuming Putin wins another presidential term at the weekend, the question mark will be whether or not Putin is interested in a more ambitious economic reform agenda.
So is Russia still essentially at the mercy of the global oil market? I mean, is it doing enough to address that and to try and diversify its economy?
In the end, I think that's a fair point. I mean, Russia is still an oil metals play. You highlighted agriculture, but I think beyond agriculture, not really enough has been, not enough focus at broader diversification. And in the end, investments. I mean, Russia is still struggling in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. And that relates again to these ideas of the business environment, property rights, rule of law, the geopolitical relationship with the West. In the end, if you're a big foreign motor manufacturing company, do you feel secure building physical assets in Russia at the moment when the relationship with the US and Europe is so difficult? Probably not.
And what are the implications of all this for ordinary Russians? I mean, Putin is still very popular with many Russians, but has he improved their economic lot?
Well, if you go back to '99 and the Yeltsin era, I mean, the answer would be yes. Living standards have improved, but the last 3-4 years have been very difficult. I mean, stagnation has been the order of the day. Everyone's been pulling their belts in because of this, the external challenge, as that would be perceived from a Russian perspective. And frustrations are building. I mean, if you look at opinion polls, people are pretty uncomfortable with government. I mean, government is pretty unpopular. Putin himself is popular because of all these foreign adventures and the very strident foreign policy and his return to like a nationalist agenda. But in terms of ordinary Russians and their day-to-day lives, I think they're not particularly happy. I mean, stagnation doesn't go down very well. There is job security, but living standards have taken a fairly significant hit. And a lot of young liberal Russians are leaving, and I think that's particularly challenging for the long-term future of the economy. Russia needs those kind of people, obviously, to bring a productivity improvement and raise that growth potential of the Russian economy. And Russia faces a real demographic time bomb. I mean, it's a declining population. Over the longer term, Russia needs to find a lot of young, dynamic people from somewhere.
You talk there about the so-called foreign adventures, and of course Ukraine and Syria come to mind, and one of Russia's other big exports is military hardware and arms. So how does that play into all of this then, as far as Russia's economy?
Well, I mean, certainly the Ukrainian intervention has not been particularly helpful. I mean, sanctions have had an impact. There was an immediate impact back in 2014. Pressure on the exchange rate, loss of reserves, policy had to be tightened, economy went into recession, accentuated the problems around lower oil prices. Since then, as I mentioned, it's resulted in much tighter fiscal and monetary policy than probably was appropriate. And we've got stagnation really as a result, or very low growth as a result. I mean, we have seen, Russia, beefing up exports of arms. That's been one of the growth sectors. You mentioned agriculture. The challenge there, I guess, still is the relationship with the West and the US in particular. The countering American adversaries through Sanctions Act could put some pressure on those arms exports. For example, Russia's plans to sell S-400 air defense systems to the Turks could fall within the remit of those US sanctions. And we could see similar actions by the Americans to counter some of these arms sales overseas by the Russians.
Good to get your analysis on this. Timothy Ash in London, thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, Zimbabwe's business community is calling for international sanctions to be removed to help improve the ailing economy. President Emmerson Mnangagwa wants to attract more foreign investors, but many are cautious about doing business with Zimbabwe. Haru Mutasa has more from Bulawayo.
Tafadzwa Musarara's milling company produces 1,800 tons of flour a month. He thinks he could double production if sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the West nearly 2 decades ago are removed. They targeted specific individuals loyal to former President Robert Mugabe. Musarara's company is not on the sanctions list, but he feels being Zimbabwean means many others like him are considered guilty by association.
We could not trade with countries or states in Europe sending money to Zimbabwe. Ultimately, it just go via New York. And there was a certain instruction that funds coming direct to Zimbabwean banks had to be frozen or confiscated or returned back. That affected us. So we could not buy from Europe. Number of companies are victims to that.
Equipment bought from Europe and the US can't easily be replaced. The state-owned railway company is one of several that needs urgent foreign direct investment. Right now, President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government is leasing locomotives and wagons from neighboring South Africa. He says it's a temporary solution until people are ready to do business with Zimbabwe again. President Mnangagwa says he'll respect human rights and hold free and fair elections. But the international community wants proof he means it. Then perhaps some or all remaining sanctions will be removed. To lure foreign investment, Mnangagwa's government says it will amend black economic empowerment laws to limit majority ownership for the state to only diamonds and platinum.
So right now all they have to work with is promises, but not many of those promises are actually being actively kept. They keep on repeating them and encourage people to believe that everything they say is going to transpire, but that's not quite enough for the investors.
And until those investors see Zimbabwe as low risk, which could take a while, remnants of the once thriving industrial sector tower over the jobless.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, why the fashion industry is being accused of ripping off traditional Mexican designs. But first, the Odebrecht corruption scandal has rocked Latin America and continues to rumble on, with Peru's president facing impeachment for a second time. Pedro Pablo Kuczynski survived a first bid to remove him from office in December, but now Congress has voted in favor of reopening proceedings against him. The 79-year-old leader is accused of lying about his ties to the Brazilian construction giant, which is at the center of a multi-billion-dollar bribery case. Kuczynski denies the charges. Experts say nearly 80% of all businesses doing business with Odebrecht are likely to end up bankrupt by the end of this month, and tens of thousands of workers have lost their jobs. This week marked the 29th birthday of the World Wide Web, and its creator, Tim Berners-Lee, issued a stark warning to mark the occasion. In an open letter to the Guardian newspaper, he was hugely critical of the tech titans that control today's internet. He's calling for more regulation to rein in the power of platforms like Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Unilever, one of the largest companies in Britain, is closing down its London offices and moving its corporate headquarters entirely to the Netherlands. The consumer goods giant's decision is a blow to British business sentiment as its government negotiates to leave the European Union. The Anglo-Dutch company already has its headquarters in Rotterdam. It's a sad week for those of us who grew up with Toys R Us. The world-famous brand has announced it will sell or close hundreds of its stores in the US, and at least 30,000 jobs will go. The 70-year-old retailer helped shape the toy industry for decades, but has faced stiff competition in recent times from online businesses. Gabriel Elizondo has the story.
I don't want to grow up. I'm Toys R Us.
For generations of children in America and around the world, it was a playground for picking out the latest toy. Everything from a new doll, bike, or toy race car. Toys R Us, like the name so aptly implies, was synonymous with any and all toys for kids. Stores could be found all over America, including in one of the most important intersections in the world, Times Square in New York City. As the business empire expanded, it opened in more than 35 other countries as well, and includes Babies R Us, stores aimed at clothing and supplies for infants. But with shoppers increasingly going online at sites such as Amazon, major high street stores are taking a hit to their profits. Toys R Us managers finally gave up, announcing that after 70 years in business, they were shutting their doors for good and closing or selling off all of the nearly 800 stores in the U.S. and around the world.
I think where Toys R Us dropped the balls in a few areas. One is their online business. Well, everybody's growing their online business. Toys R Us was down 12%. They perform extremely poorly online.
Trouble had been brewing for the company for years, and its chief executive complained last year about the challenges it faced.
It's so competitive. It's a $25 billion industry, and every marketer out there wants to try to get their arms around those young families. Certainly the online business has made it even more attractive for customers to price shop and look at various alternatives. So it's a very competitive business.
But Toys R Us has many self-inflicted wounds, primarily about $5 billion worth of debts, which meant there wasn't much money to upgrade stores. The company filed for bankruptcy last year. Toys R Us employs about 60,000 people around the world. Now they are looking for new jobs. Gabriel Elizondo for Counting the Cost in New York.
Now, the biggest initial public offering the world has ever seen has been delayed when Saudi Arabia said it was going to sell 5% of its state energy giant Saudi Aramco to public investors. Top stock exchanges sat up and took notice. The flotation was tipped to happen this year, but now Saudi Aramco says it needs to review its options for the listing. Well, joining us now from London is Professor Paul Stevens, a fellow at Chatham House in London. Thanks very much for being with us. So, what do you make of what's happening with this IPO, or as the case may be, what's not happening, because we haven't really heard any firm announcement from the company as to when this will be happening?
I think the problem is that they've run into serious problems, and the problem was created in April 2016 when Mohammed bin Salman first announced the privatization, because at that point he put a valuation on Saudi Aramco of $2 trillion. This was achieved by a rather simplistic piece of arithmetic. You take the reserves, 266 billion barrels, and then multiply it by an oil price. And the oil price they took was $7.50 a barrel, which was the price that Total had paid when they bought Maersk. But the problem with that is that to say then they're going to take 5% gives a benchmark, i.e. $100 billion. And if the privatization goes ahead and they get less than $100 billion, this will be seen as a failure. And this is bad news from MBS's point of view. So my sense is that they're desperately trying to sort of wriggle out of the privatization process because the valuation is grossly overstated and they're unlikely to get the 100 billion. And the last thing that MBS needs at the moment is some sort of an obvious failure.
And when you're talking about MBS, you're of course talking about the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And this has been seen, this whole Aramco IPO has been seen as the linchpin of his overall strategy of reforming the Saudi economy. So could we see this as a setback for that then?
Not necessarily for reforming the economy, but certainly to make the IPO the proverbial jewel in the crown, I think was a mistake, because as I say, they've created a benchmark by which you can judge the success or failure of this. And I think this is the reason for the delay in the process. I suspect that they're more likely to try and go ahead with a private sale, because the beauty of a private sale is nobody will know if it's failed or succeeded, because you won't actually know what the price is.
But what message is all of this sending to foreign investors, this apparent lack of transparency from the company and from Saudi officials on this?
I don't think it's particularly good news from that point of view, and indeed I think more important was the arrest in November of a number of senior businessmen in the kingdom. And this illustrates a fundamental problem in Saudi Arabia, and that is a lack of real property rights. And if you are a foreign investor, I think you're going to be looking very hard at the kingdom before putting money in there. And indeed, the private sector within Saudi Arabia will also look hard at investing within the kingdom.
And how important is this IPO to the business of the foreign exchanges that are competing for its listing, namely the London Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange?
Well, that's another problem with the privatisation, because neither would be a good place to put the privatisation into. The United States, because of problems with the Jazeera Act, which would allow American citizens effectively to sue the American government. Also, on NYMEX, the rules for listing reserves are very strict, and Saudi Aramco would struggle with those rules. And in London, as the rules stand at the moment, they can't privatise less than 25%. Now, London is trying to change those rules, but there's a lot of opposition within the institutions in the City of London opposing that. So both options at the moment are not looking attractive.
And what are the implications of this for the Saudi economy domestically?
I don't think they're that important, and it certainly shouldn't stop the process, the much needed process of economic reform that is actually underway. They were hoping to get $100 billion from the sale, but there are other sources of income for that. And therefore, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference to the reform program, providing it's not seen as a failure. In other words, providing they don't go ahead with the IPO and get significantly less than $100 billion.
Good to speak with you, Paul Stevens in London.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mexico's famous for its highly patented artwork, and the fashion world has taken notice. But what happens if traditional designs from a centuries-old culture reappear on the catwalk and in global merchandise? Who should profit from it, and who really owns the intellectual property? John Holman has more from Mexico City.
It's taken Ezequiel Vicente a lifetime to get to here, when the pen seems to guide itself. What he sees in his community of Tenango, Mexico, flies off the page, made flesh by his wife. This intricate dream world has been built up in the imagination of generations of Tenango craftspeople. Together, the communities become famous for these tapestries. Now they're worried that their shared heritage is being exploited by big brands who use their designs but don't share the profits.
We can make anything we're asked to, but we should be paid a fair amount. That way we can get ahead, generate employment here, and pay people right.
A recent study by NGO Impacto concludes that 8 clothing brands have plagiarized indigenous designs. The Spanish clothing firm Mango used a Tenango design in this sweater. After complaints, they withdrew it and wrote a letter pledging to help the community. Several indigenous communities in Mexico have their own distinctive designs which are sold locally in shops and markets. These are often poor people, so when they see their patterns being used in mass-produced or luxury clothing without compensation or recognition, it really rankles. The problem is judging when the thin line between inspiration and plagiarism is crossed. Defining that by copyright is tough, because the designs are often the cultural heritage of entire communities rather than just one person. Congresswoman Paula Felix says companies shouldn't see it as a legal question, but one of moral duty.
They need to get ethically responsible, because at the end of the day, it's stealing the designs of Mexican craftspeople. We have to have the awareness to say you can't exploit the designs in other countries and say they are yours.
It's a complicated picture, but the very fact it's being watched more closely than ever may mean a fairer deal for Mexico's craftspeople.
And that is our show for this week. And as always, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.